The dust of Saguaro Flats was the color of old blood. It settled on everything. A fine red powder that coated the splintered boards of the courthouse steps, crept through the warped window frames, and drew a gritty film across Eleanor Hale's tongue. She stood before the makeshift judge's bench, a heavy pine desk scarred with the brands of a dozen ranches, and tried to keep her hands from trembling. They were clenched at her sides, knuckles white, her calico dress damp with sweat in the stifling heat of the New Mexico Territory courtroom. It was 1883 and justice was a dry, choking thing. Across the desk, Judge Avery polished his spectacles with a handkerchief that had long since given up on being white. He was a man worn smooth by the harshness of the land and the harder men who ruled it. He avoided her eyes. The man who did not avoid her eyes was Elias Thorne. He sat beside the judge. Though he was neither lawyer nor lawman, he didn't need to be. Thorne owned the biggest ranch, the deepest wells, and most of the men in the territory. He was a man built of steel and silence, his suit a stark black against the room's dusty brown, his face a mask of bored authority. It was two of his men, his hired guns, that her brother Owen was accused of putting in the ground. "The boy is guilty, Judge," Thorne said, his voice low and flat, carrying no more emotion than a stone skipping across a dry creek bed. "Two witnesses saw him. He was drunk, angry about the new fence line. He drew first. He was defending our water rights." Eleanor's voice came out sharper than she intended, a crack in the oppressive quiet. "Your men were diverting Hale Creek. Owen just went to talk to them." Thorne offered a slight, dismissive smile that did not reach his cold gray eyes. "They are dead, Miss Hale." His talk was louder than theirs. "It seems the circuit marshal has the paperwork. The trial is a formality. The gallows are already built." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She could picture it, the raw pine frame, stark against the endless blue sky. Owen, his face pale, his wrists bound. He was only 19, full of more fire than sense. The last family she had left. Their mother had succumbed to fever 2 years prior, and their father, a man who believed in laws and fairness, had been crushed by a spooked horse a year before that, leaving them with a failing ranch and a mountain of debt. Hale Creek was all they had, and now Thorne was taking that too. Judge Avery cleared his throat, finally placing his spectacles back on his nose. "Eleanor," he said, his tone softened by a pity she did not want. "The evidence is substantial without a proper defense." "There is no defense money can buy in this territory that Mr. Thorne doesn't already own," she stated, the truth of it bitter as alkali dust. Thorne leaned forward, placing his manicured hands on the desk. The gesture was deliberate, a display of clean, unworked skin in a world of calluses and scars. "However," he said, drawing the word out, "I am not an unreasonable man. I have no desire to see a boy hang. It is inefficient, a waste of good rope." A sliver of hope, treacherous and thin, pierced through Eleanor's despair. She looked at him, waiting. "I have a proposition," Thorne continued. "A trade. The boy's life is forfeit to the law, but the law in this territory listens to me. I can persuade the judge to see reason, to be lenient. I can make the charges disappear." "What trade?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. Thorne's gaze flickered over her, a slow, appraising look that made her feel like a head of cattle being sized up for market. It lingered on her face, her hands, the worn fabric of her dress. "You," he said simply, "for him." The air in the room became thick, unbreathable. She could feel the eyes of the bailiff, of the clerk, of the 2 dusty ranchers who'd come in to file a deed and stayed to watch the show. They were all looking at her, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to detached interest. She was no longer Eleanor Hale, a woman fighting for her brother. She was a piece on a game board. "You want to marry me?" she asked, the words tasting like ash. The thought was repulsive. To be the wife of Elias Thorne, to live in his sterile, imposing ranch house, to be another one of his possessions. A dry chuckle escaped Thorne's lips. "Good Lord, no, child. I have no need for a wife. I have a need for order, for loyalty. I am offering you in marriage to another." Confusion warred with her dread. To who? To my tracker, Thorne said, at CD. The name fell into the room and seemed to suck the remaining air out of it. Even Judge Avery shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Eleanor had heard the name. Everyone in Saguaro Flats had. It was spoken in hushed tones in the saloon, a name used to frighten greenhorns and settle arguments. Atsidi, the Apache, the one they called Red Hawk. He was Thorne's shadow, his most effective tool, a man who moved through the unforgiving landscape as if he were born from the rock and scrub itself. The stories were legion. When prospectors tried to jump Thorne's claims, they vanished. When rustlers hid his herds, they vanished. When a rival rancher threatened his water access, the man and his 2 sons rode out one morning and vanished. The official count, the one whispered over warm beer and poker games, was 17 men in 3 years. 17 men erased from the earth. No one ever found a body. No one ever spoke of a struggle or a bloody fight. There were no tales of cruelty, no gory details to relish. That was the most terrifying part. Red Hawk's work was clean, absolute, and silent. He wasn't a butcher. He was an ending. "You want me to marry him," Eleanor breathed, the idea so monstrous it was difficult to comprehend. A savage, a ghost who left no tracks and spoke to no one. "He is a man, Miss Hale, a very capable man," Thorne said, the corner of his mouth twitching. "He keeps my borders secure. He deserves a reward. A wife will keep him settled, tied to the land, my land." He leaned back, his point made. He wasn't rewarding his tracker. He was putting a leash on him, a human leash, and she was to be the collar. The room was silent. The weight of the bargain pressed down on her, crushing the air from her lungs. Marry a phantom, a man whose reputation was built on disappeared souls, or watch her brother, her foolish, brave, 19-year-old brother, climb the gallows. Hale Creek would be lost either way. Thorne would see to that. This was just about the cruelty of the choice. She looked at Judge Avery, a silent plea in her eyes. He met her gaze for a brief, fleeting moment before looking down at his desk, a faint flush rising above his collar. He was ashamed, but his shame was a useless currency here. He picked up his gavel, a silent confirmation of his impotence. He leaned across the desk, his voice a low, hurried murmur meant only for her. "Listen to me, girl. This is the only deal you'll get. There won't be another, 'It's him,' or the rope for Owen, next week. Next week." The words tolled like a funeral bell. 7 days. Eleanor closed her eyes, picturing Owen's face, his easy grin, the way his hair fell over his eyes, the fierce, protective love he had for their land, a love that had led him here. She could not let him die. She could not. Whatever life she might have had, whatever dreams of a quiet future with a kind husband and children of her own, they had already turned to dust. There was only this grim, impossible choice. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Elias Thorne. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her voice was steady when she spoke. It did not tremble. "I will not give you my answer now." Thorne raised an eyebrow, a flicker of annoyance in his placid demeanor. "This is not a negotiation. Miss Hale." "I am not negotiating my brother's life," she said, her words precise. "I am setting a condition for my own. You are asking me to bind myself to a man I have never seen, a man known only by whispers and the fear he leaves behind. I will not say yes to a ghost." She took a breath, holding his gaze. "Give me 3 days. 3 days for what Thorne asked, his voice laced with impatience, to pray for a miracle. "To meet him," Eleanor said, "to look him in the eye. I need to see the man whose life I'm to be shackled to. 3 days. That is my price for an answer." A long silence stretched. Thorne studied her, his gray eyes narrowed. He was a man accustomed to immediate obedience. This small act of defiance, this demand for a sliver of dignity in her own damnation, seemed to intrigue him. He glanced at the judge, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The bargain was too good for Thorne to refuse over such a small matter. Finally, Thorne smiled again, that same cold, humorless expression. "Very well. Miss Hale, You may have your 3 days. You can look into the man's eyes all you wish. But on the 3rd day I will have your answer. And it will be yes, one way or another." He stood, signaling the end of the proceedings. The boy remains in the marshal's custody. Judge Avery rapped his gavel weakly on the desk. "This court is adjourned." The ranchers shuffled out, whispering between themselves. The bailiff unlocked the heavy door to the holding cell, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she might see Owen, but they let him out a back way. The room emptied, leaving her alone with the dust motes dancing in the shafts of afternoon light. She stood frozen for a moment, the enormity of what she had done washing over her. She had bought 3 days, 3 days to stare into the face of a storm. As if summoned by the thought, a shadow fell across the room. The heavy main doors of the courthouse groaned open. A figure stood silhouetted against the blinding, white-hot glare of the Saguaro Flats sun. Eleanor squinted, her hand rising to shield her eyes. The figure was tall and lean, framed by the doorway. He did not move. He did not speak. The frantic buzzing of a fly caught in a spiderweb near the window suddenly sounded as loud as a drum. As her eyes adjusted, details began to emerge from the light. He was dressed not in buckskin and feathers, but in simple denim trousers and a plain, dark cotton shirt, worn but clean. His black hair was tied back at the nape of his neck, severe and practical. He was utterly still, a study in quiet intensity. The world outside was a furnace of heat and light and wind, but inside the doorway, there was only a profound and unnerving silence. He stood there, a man carved from the very stone of the desert, his face unreadable in the harsh light. He was the secret Elias Thorne kept buried in silence, and he was waiting. Thorne's ranch was a scar on the landscape, a place of unnerving order carved into the wild chaos of the desert. Fences ran in brutally straight lines. The main house was a 2-story monument to angles and imported wood, and even the dust seemed to settle in neat, disciplined patterns. Elias Thorne led Eleanor not to the house, but toward the sprawling corrals where the air was thick with the scent of horse, hay, and hot leather. He walked with the easy stride of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. Eleanor followed, her own steps feeling tentative and foreign on this land bought with intimidation and paid for with the fear of men like her brother. They stopped at a large breaking pen, its circular fence made of thick, smooth logs. Inside, a magnificent white stallion, a creature of pure spirit and untamed energy, was in the grips of a raw panic. Its eyes were wide, showing the whites, its coat was dark with sweat, and it lunged against the fence, muscles trembling with a terror that was almost painful to watch. Several of Thorne's ranch hands stood at a safe distance, their expressions a mixture of frustration and grudging admiration for the horse's fight. And in the center of that storm of fear stood Red Hawk. He was exactly as he had been in the courthouse doorway, a figure of profound stillness. He held no rope, no whip. His hands were open at his sides. He simply stood, watching the horse, his posture relaxed, his presence a point of calm in the swirling chaos. The stallion would rear and plunge, kicking up clouds of red dust, and Red Hawk would not flinch. He just watched, his dark eyes taking in every shudder, every panicked snort. "Stubborn beast," Thorne commented, his voice a flat intrusion. "Belonged to a homesteader over the ridge. The man had an accident. The horse is wild. Cost me 2 good men with broken bones already. But my tracker here, he has a way with things that don't listen to reason." As if on cue, Red Hawk began to move. It wasn't a walk so much as a slow, deliberate glide. He didn't approach the horse head-on, but circled with it, mirroring its frantic energy with a quiet, patient rhythm. He began to breathe. Long, slow exhalations that were barely audible but seemed to cut through the horse's panicked gasps. He was not trying to conquer the animal's fear. He was offering it a different rhythm to follow. Slowly, incredibly, the stallion's lunges became less violent. Its ears, which had been pinned back in terror, began to flicker, testing the air. Red Hawk continued his slow circle, his soft breathing, and then he extended a hand, palm up. He did not reach for the horse. He simply offered his hand to the space between them. The stallion shied, snorting, but its back step was less frantic. Red Hawk held his position, his hand an unmoving invitation. The horse watched him, its great chest heaving. It took a hesitant step forward, then another. It lowered its head, nostrils flaring, and stretched its neck until its wet nose brushed against Red Hawk's fingertips. The contact was electric. A tremor ran through the animal, a great, shuddering release of tension. Red Hawk did not stroke it. He just allowed the contact, his fingers still, his breathing steady. He murmured something in a language Eleanor did not recognize, a sound like wind over smooth stones. The horse closed its eyes and leaned into his touch, its panic broken. Thorn made a sound of satisfaction. See a useful tool? Red Hawk showed no sign of having heard him. He kept his focus entirely on the horse, now running his hand slowly up its neck, along the powerful arch of its back. He seemed to draw the last of the fear out of the creature with his bare hands. He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on a small notepad and a piece of charcoal sitting on a fence post. He walked to it, his movements economical and precise, and wrote a few words. He tore the small sheet off and held it out, not to Thorn, but to Eleanor. Hesitantly, she took it. The handwriting was clean, stark, with no wasted flourishes. It said, "Animals do not know betrayal." The words settled deep in her gut. It wasn't just about the horse. It was a statement of fact, a piece of his own history written on a scrap of paper. She looked from the note to his face, truly seeing it for the first time in the clear light. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps not yet 30. His features were sharp, his cheekbones high and his jaw strong, and then she saw the scar. It was a thin, white line that started at his right temple, slicing down across his cheekbone and ending just below his jaw. It was an old wound, one that told a story of violence. She found her voice, the question tearing out of her before she could stop it. Blunt and raw, "Am I a pair of handcuffs for you?" He met her gaze directly. There was no surprise in his eyes, no anger, only a deep, unreadable stillness. He took the notepad back and wrote again, a single word this time. He held it out for her to see. A shield. The word made no sense. A shield. How could she, a woman being forced into this bargain to save her brother, be a shield for a man who moved through the world like a ghost? A man feared by all, a shield from what? From Thorn. It was Thorn who was binding them together. The word hung in the air between them, a puzzle she could not solve. Thorn, sensing a shift in the dynamics he could not control, stepped forward. His polished boots crunched in the dust. He looked Red Hawk up and down with an owner's dismissive air. "You see the marks on his wrists," he said to Eleanor, though his eyes were fixed on the tracker. Eleanor hadn't noticed before, but now she saw faint, pale bands of scarred tissue circled both of his wrists, the kind of marks left by ropes pulled tight long ago, cinched down to the bone on a body that was still growing. Army patrol found him when he was just a boy, maybe 10 years old, sole survivor of a raid. They tied him to a supply wagon for 2 weeks, said he was feral, Thorn said, a cruel nostalgia in his voice. Took me a year to get him to stop fighting the bit, so to speak. But you can teach a wolf tricks. It's still a wolf. Never forget that. Miss Hale. Eleanor didn't respond to Thorn. She couldn't take her eyes off Red Hawk. She watched for the flicker of rage, the clenching of a fist, any sign of the violence the world expected of him. There was nothing. His face remained a mask of stoicism, but she saw it in his posture, a rigidity that hadn't been there a moment before. He was absorbing Thorn's words, containing them within his silence, and the effort of it was immense. His silence was not empty. It was a fortress. Without a word, Red Hawk turned and walked toward the gate of the pen, leaving the now calm stallion behind. He unlatched it and looked at Eleanor. A clear, silent command. "Follow me." She glanced at Thorn, who gave a magnanimous wave of his hand. "Go on. Have a look at your future. Just be back before dark." She followed Red Hawk away from the main ranch, past the bunkhouse and the blacksmith's shed, toward the edge of the property where the tamed land gave way to the harsh, open desert. His home was not a house, not even a cabin. It was a small, low-lying adobe hut, the color of the earth it was made from, so seamless with the landscape that one could almost miss it. It was isolated, a place for a man who lived on the periphery of the world. He pushed open the simple wooden door and stood aside for her to enter. The inside was as spare as the outside. It was a single room, cool and dim after the glare of the sun. There was a simple cot in one corner with a wool blanket folded neatly upon it. A small, crude table and a single stool stood in the center. There was no clutter, no decoration, save for 3 items that seemed to hold the entirety of the man's identity. On the table sat a small, intricately woven Apache basket, its geometric patterns telling a story she couldn't read. Leaning against the wall near the cot was a simple wooden flute, its surface polished smooth by countless hours of handling. And on the floor, stacked neatly against the adobe wall, was a pile of notebooks, identical to the one he carried, at least a dozen of them, bound in worn leather. It was a room of profound solitude, the dwelling of a man who possessed nothing and yet seemed to be missing nothing. He saw her looking at the notebooks. He went to the table, picked up his charcoal, and wrote on a fresh sheet. "I speak English when I must," the note read. "For the rest, I let the desert speak." It was the most he had ever said to her. It was a philosophy, a creed. He had chosen this silence, weaponized it, made it his home. She thought of the 17 men who had vanished. They had been swallowed by that silence, by a man who spoke the language of the desert, of the wind and the rock and the heat, a language no white man could understand. He reached for the stack of notebooks, picking up the one from the very top. He held it for a moment, his thumb tracing the worn edge. He seemed to be deciding something. Then, he opened it to a page near the middle. He didn't offer it to her, but he angled it so she could see. The page was not filled with words. It was a drawing, repeated over and over again, a circular design of strange, interlocking lines and symbols. It looked ancient, primal. It wasn't a brand or a symbol she recognized. It was more like a seal, an impression made in the earth, a mark of ownership that felt older than any deed or document filed in Judge Avery's courthouse. The image was obsessive, drawn with a heavy, focused hand, as if the act of drawing it was the only thing that mattered. Her eyes widened in question. She opened her mouth to ask, the sound forming in her throat. Before she could speak, he snapped the notebook shut. The sound was sharp, final, in the quiet room. He placed it back on the stack and picked up his charcoal one last time. His movements were swift, decisive. He wrote 2 words on the paper and held it up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The message was an undeniable command. A wall of silence slammed down between them. "Do not ask." The first day of her trial began not in a courthouse, but in the vast, silent courtroom of the desert. Red Hawk was waiting for her at the edge of Thorne's property as the sun was just beginning to burn the chill from the night air. He held the reins of 2 horses, a sturdy-looking bay for her and the white stallion from the day before, which now stood with the placid obedience of a saint. He had not been tamed, he had chosen to trust. Red Hawk gave her a brief, assessing look, then simply nodded toward the bay. There was no good morning, no explanation. The ordeal had begun. She mounted, her worn riding skirt feeling flimsy and inadequate. He swung onto the stallion's bare back with a fluid grace that was part of the animal itself, and they rode out. He did not lead her on a trail. He led her into the seemingly featureless expanse of rock and creosote bush. After a few minutes, he stopped and dismounted, his eyes fixed on the ground. Eleanor followed his gaze and saw nothing, just dirt, pebbles, a few blades of sun-scorched grass. He crouched, his long fingers hovering just above the ground. He pointed to a single, tiny stone that had been overturned, showing its paler, damper underside. He then pointed to a bent stalk of grass a few feet away. His finger traced an invisible line in the air between them. He looked up at her, his expression questioning, expectant. She shook her head. "I don't see anything." He showed no impatience. He simply pulled his notepad from a pouch at his belt and wrote, "Coyote, 1 hour ago, dragging a rabbit." She looked again, trying to see the world through his eyes. How could he possibly know it was a kind of magic, a language she had never imagined existed? He continued on, stopping every few hundred feet to point out a new sign, the faint scuff of a lizard's tail, the deeper print of a doe's hoof, the edges still sharp, indicating it was fresh. He was not just looking at the ground, he was reading a living page, a story written moment by moment. He paused and held up a hand, listening. He pointed to the sky where a hawk circled lazily, then gestured to the north. He wrote again, "Wind tells the direction, birds tell of men." A short while later, they crested a low mesa and saw them a group of Mexican vaqueros, driving a small herd of cattle. They were Thorne's men, but they carried themselves with a different air than the grim-faced gunmen at the ranch. They were laughing, their wide-brimmed sombreros tilted against the sun. As they drew near, the laughter died down. The leader, a weathered man with a magnificent gray mustache, reined in his horse. He looked at Red Hawk, then at Eleanor, his dark eyes missing nothing. Eleanor braced herself for the same leering appraisal she'd received in town, the look that stripped a woman down to her use and value. But it never came. The head vaquero simply touched the brim of his sombrero in a gesture of respect. "Señor Halcón Rojo," he said, his voice raspy. He nodded to Eleanor. "Señorita." Red Hawk gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in return. There was a clear, unspoken understanding between them. The vaqueros gave them a wide berth, their gazes curious but respectful. No one smirked, no one whispered. In their eyes, Red Hawk was not Thorne's savage tool. He was a man of consequence, a man who had earned their deference, and because she was with him, that deference extended to her. It was the first time in days she had felt like something other than a piece of property. They rode on, the silence between them less of a void and more of a shared space. He was teaching her, and she was trying to learn. She began to see the subtle shifts in the landscape, to notice the way the light changed the color of the rocks, to feel the direction of the wind on her skin. She was a guest in his world, a world that had existed long before the straight lines of Thorne's fences had been hammered into the earth. That evening, back in her small, borrowed room in Thorne's main house, she was too exhausted to eat. The day had been a physical and mental ordeal. She lay on the cot, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night, the distant nickering of horses, the low murmur of the bunkhouse, the lonely cry of a night bird. And then, another sound drifted through her open window. It was thin and pure, a melody that seemed to be woven from moonlight and sorrow. The flute. It was him. The music was not complex, but it was profoundly expressive. It spoke of loss, of vast, empty spaces, of a grief so deep it had become a part of the landscape itself. It was a lament, a prayer for all the things that had been lost and would never be found again. Lying there in the dark, listening to the soul of the silent man. Eleanor felt a tremor of understanding. His silence wasn't a choice born of anger, but a sanctuary built over a wound. The second day, he took her to a different place, a shallow, wind-swept arroyo where the heat was trapped between the rock walls. He stopped and pointed to a faint circle of blackened stones, half buried in the sand. It was an old fire pit, but it was barely visible. The stones were scattered, and the ground had been trampled by cattle and scarred by the wheels of a heavy wagon. He knelt and brushed the sand away from one of the stones, his touch gentle, reverent. He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of raw emotion in his eyes. It was a deep, quiet anger, the anger of a man witnessing a desecration. He wrote on his pad, "My people's camp. The marks are gone." He dug his fingers into the sandy soil near the fire pit and pulled something out. It was a shard of pottery, painted with a black, geometric design. The edges were broken, but the fragment was beautiful, a piece of a life that had once been lived here. He stood and pressed it into her palm. Her fingers closed around its surprising coolness. He met her eyes, and his gaze was heavy with the weight of all he could not say. He leaned in, and his voice was a dry whisper, the first words she had ever heard him speak in English. "Remember, for me." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone with the piece of his past in her hand. The two words echoed in her mind. He was entrusting her with a memory, a fragment of his erased history. He was asking her to be a witness. That night, the fragile peace was shattered. Thorne was hosting a dinner party. A cattle baron from Tucson and a government land agent were his guests of honor. The dining room was ablaze with candlelight, the table laden with roast beef, whiskey, and imported cigars. The air was thick with boastful talk and the smoke of self-congratulation. Eleanor was required to attend. Thorne had sent Maria, his quiet, efficient Mexican housekeeper, with a dark green dress that was far finer than anything Eleanor owned. It felt like a costume, a prop for the role he had assigned her. She sat silently at the table, a ghost at their feast, picking at her food. "It is a matter of progress, gentlemen," Thorne was saying, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "This land is untamed. It needs a firm hand. It needs to be civilized. We are bringing order, productivity. We are building a future." The land agent, a portly man with a sweating brow, nodded vigorously. "Indeed, Mr. Thorne, your efforts in pacifying the territory have not gone unnoticed in Santa Fe." The word hung in the air. Pacifying. A clean, sterile word for a dirty, bloody business. Eleanor thought of the scattered fire pit, the vanished men, the scar on Red Hawk's face. She thought of her brother sitting in a cell. This was their progress. And what of the people who were here before? Eleanor asked, her voice quiet but clear. The men turned to look at her, surprised by her interruption. Thorne gave her a condescending smile. "The Apache, they are a primitive people, Miss Hale. They do not understand the concept of ownership or progress. They simply wander. We are providing them with structure." The pottery shard felt heavy in the pocket of her dress. "Is it civilizing, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her eyes meeting his across the candle flames. "Or is it stealing?" The room went dead silent. The cattle baron choked on his cigar smoke. The land agent's fork clattered onto his plate. Thorne's smile vanished. His eyes, which had been a cold gray, seemed to transform. They became flat, hard, and empty of all light. They were the color of forged steel, of a rifle barrel in the moonlight. The mask of the reasonable rancher had fallen away, and in its place was the predator she had sensed all along. He said nothing, but the threat in his eyes was as clear as a drawn knife. The third day, Red Hawk met her with the pistol. It was a Colt Peacemaker, heavy and smelling of oil. He didn't take her to the desert. He led her behind the blacksmith's shed, where a line of tin cans was set up on a fence rail. He showed her how to hold it, how to check the load, how to aim. His hands briefly covered hers, guiding her grip, and his touch was impersonal, the detached instruction of a teacher. But she was aware of the calloused skin, the latent strength in his fingers. "Breathe out," he wrote on his pad. "Squeeze, do not pull." Her first shot went wide, kicking up a puff of dust. The recoil jarred her arm to the shoulder. The noise was shocking. He simply reset the hammer and nodded for her to try again. The second shot missed. The third hit the edge of a can, sending it spinning. She looked at him, a small flicker of pride in her chest. He did not smile. He took the notepad and wrote a longer sentence than usual. "Only shoot when there is room for regret." She read it twice, letting the meaning sink in. It was his warrior's code, his philosophy of violence, compressed into a single, stark sentence. "Do not kill in a rage you cannot take back. Understand the cost." Later that afternoon, as she was returning the borrowed dress to the main house, Maria intercepted her in the hallway. The housekeeper was carrying a stack of clean linens, her face a mask of worried neutrality. "Señorita," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper, a word. She led Eleanor into the laundry room. a place steamy and smelling of soap. You must be careful. El Patron, Mr. Thorn, he is not a man to cross. I know, Eleanor said. No, you do not, Maria insisted, her dark eyes intense. You think this marriage is the end of the bargain? It is the beginning. Once you are wed, he holds the reins on you both. For your husband, he will use the law, any trouble, and he will remind everyone that he is a savage, that he only walks free because of Thorn's mercy. For you, he will use your brother, and for both of you, he will use water and he will use debt. He will own you, your land, your life, your husband's silence, everything. The warning settled like a stone in Eleanor's stomach. She had known it, but hearing it spoken aloud by someone who had watched Thorn for years gave it a terrifying new reality. As she left the laundry, a knot of dread tightening inside her. She heard voices coming from Thorn's office, the door slightly ajar. It was Thorn and his foreman, a hard man named Cutter. She paused, hidden by the turn in the hallway. Getting impatient, Cutter was saying, "The Hale girl is dragging her feet." She will agree. Thorn's voice was a confident, cold drawl. She has no choice, but we will not wait for her answer to secure the land. It's time to accelerate the process. The same as we did with the Miller place, Cutter asked. The same, but cleaner, Thorn replied. I want you to take 5 or 6 of the boys, use the paint and the feathers from the storeroom, make it look authentic. Ride down to Hale Creek the night after the wedding. A small Apache raid. Frighten them. Burn the old barn. Make sure a few stray shots hit the house. It will be a tragedy. The settlers will demand protection. The army will move the last of the real Apache off the reservation lands, and I will step in to buy the unsafe Hale property for pennies on the dollar to secure the water rights for the good of the community. No one will question it. Eleanor stood frozen in the hallway, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a gasp. The blood drained from her face, leaving her cold and numb. It was a trap, a monstrous, perfectly planned trap. They were going to use a false flag, an attack staged to look like the work of Apaches, to steal her land and drive a final nail into the coffin of Red Hawk's people. And the centerpiece of the entire charade was her. Her wedding was the trigger. She was not just a leash or a shield, she was the bait. The words she had overheard were a venom, spreading cold and fast through her veins. Eleanor didn't run. She walked, her steps measured and deliberate, fighting the urge to look over her shoulder. She left the main house, her mind a maelstrom of fear and fury, and headed directly for the one place on Thorn's ranch that felt like an island of truth, the small adobe hut. She found him outside, mending a leather bridle with a bone awl. His hands were steady, his focus absolute. He looked up as she approached, his dark eyes instantly registering the panic she was trying so hard to conceal. He put down his work and stood, waiting. The words tumbled out of her, a frantic, whispered torrent. Thorn, he's planning it. After the wedding, he's sending his men, Cutter and the others, dressed as Apache. Feathers and paint, he said. They're going to attack Hale Creek, burn the barn, make it look like a raid. She was gasping for air, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. It's not just about scaring me. He wants the land. He wants the army to come, to clear the territory. He's using us. He's using you to create a reason to destroy your people, and using me to set the trap. He listened without interruption, his face an unreadable mask of stone, but she saw the change. It was in the tightening of the muscles along his jaw, the almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes. The stillness that had once seemed like a form of peace now coiled into something dangerous, the lethal calm at the eye of a hurricane. When she finished, breathless and shaking, he did not reach for his notepad. He stood in the fading light, the silence stretching between them, thick with the weight of her revelation. He looked past her, his gaze fixed on the distant, purple mountains that were the last refuge of his people. Then his eyes met hers, and they held an intensity that seared through her fear, replacing it with a cold, hard resolve. He spoke. His voice was deeper than she'd imagined, rough from disuse, like stones grinding together in a dry riverbed. It held no tremor, only a terrible, final clarity. "If we do this," he said, the words slow and deliberate, "we do it to the end." The "we" was a lifeline. In that single word, she was no longer alone. The forced marriage was no longer a sentence, it was a strategy. The terror she felt began to recede, replaced by a fragile, defiant hope. "We accept the terms," she said, her voice finding its strength. "We go through with the wedding. It's the only way to stay close, to know his plans, to be inside the den when the trap is sprung." He gave a single, sharp nod. The bargain was sealed. Not the one Thorne had made in the courthouse, but a new one, forged between them in the dust and the twilight. A pact of survival. He gestured for her to enter the hut, inside, in the cool dimness. He lit a small tallow lamp. The flickering light cast long shadows on the adobe walls. He took out his notepad, as if the weight of a longer conversation was still too foreign. He wrote, "He has a man in the army, Captain Caro. He was my captain." Eleanor waited as he continued to write, the charcoal stick moving swiftly across the page. "There was an ambush. Chiricahua. My patrol was killed. Caro said I led them into it. He said I was a traitor. It was his deal with Thorne. Thorne wanted the land the patrol was surveying. Caro got paid. I was to be an example." The scarred wrists, the years of silence. It all snapped into place. He hadn't just been found, he had been framed. His silence was not just a shield against the world, but a prison built by Thorne's lies. He had survived by making himself invisible, useful, by burying the man he had been. "So you became his dog," Eleanor whispered, not as an accusation, but as a dawning, horrified understanding. "The feral wolf he told me he tamed." His eyes flashed, and he wrote one final, fierce sentence. "A dog remembers the hand that strikes it." Their path was clear. They needed proof, not just whispers and accusations, but hard, undeniable evidence that a judge, even a compromised one like Avery, could not ignore. But Thorne was meticulous. His secrets would be buried deep, as if summoned by their desperate need. A soft knock came at the door. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. Red Hawk moved to the door, silent as a shadow, and opened it a crack. It was Maria, her face etched with worry in the lamplight. She slipped inside, clutching a small object in her hand. "I heard," she whispered, her Spanish accent thick with urgency. "In the kitchen. El Patron drinks and he talks. He thinks no one listens to the housekeeper." She looked from Eleanor to Red Hawk, her eyes filled with a shared, simmering resentment. "My brother. He lost his farm to Mr. Thorne 10 years ago. A fire in the night. They called it an accident." She opened her hand. Lying on her palm was a small, ornate iron key. "This is for the storeroom behind his office. It is where he keeps his ledgers, the real ones, not the books he shows the taxman." She pressed the key into Eleanor's hand. "Be careful. He counts every bullet and every penny. He will know if something is disturbed." She gave Red Hawk a deep, meaningful look. "Vaya con Dios, halcon rojo." Then she was gone, melting back into the darkness. The key felt heavy, a tangible piece of hope. They waited until the ranch was deep in sleep, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a lone coyote. They moved through the shadows, Red Hawk's steps completely silent on the hard-packed earth. He was a ghost in his own element. The storeroom was a small, windowless chamber reeking of leather, gun oil, and dry paper. It was obsessively organized. Crates of ammunition were stacked against one wall, new saddles on another, and in the corner, a heavy iron lockbox. Red Hawk produced a thin piece of wire from his boot and knelt before it. With a patience that was unnerving to watch, he worked the lock. After a few tense minutes, there was a soft click. Inside were several leather-bound ledgers. Eleanor held the lamp while Red Hawk turned the pages. Most of it was ranch business, meticulous records of cattle sales and supply costs. But in the back of the newest ledger, under a section marked Expenses, Special Projects, they found it. A list of names, Cutter, and 5 others. Beside each name was a date and a sum of money, and next to the list, a single damning notation: equipment, HC project, paint, feathers, torches. H.C. Hale Creek. It was the receipt for their own destruction. Red Hawk carefully tore the page from the book, the sound of the ripping paper deafening in the silence. They had their first piece of the puzzle. As they slipped back out into the night, the image of the ledger triggered a memory in Eleanor's mind, a ghost from her own past. "My father," she said, her voice low and urgent. "He had a printing press, a small, hand-cranked thing. He used to print pamphlets, editorials against the railroad monopolies, against the cattle barons who were grabbing all the water. He said words were the only bullets a poor man could afford." She paused, the memory becoming clearer, more vital. He kept the press in the old barn, and he was always afraid someone would try to silence him. He used to hide his important papers, his research, his correspondence. Red Hawk looked at her, then toward the dark outline of the Hale Creek property, miles away. He didn't need his notepad. 2 words, spoken in his rough whisper, were enough to voice their shared thought. "The barn." Then he shook his head, a gesture of grim finality. "The barn is burned." A fire of defiance lit inside her, chasing away the despair. She met his gaze in the moonlight. "Iron does not burn." They saddled the horses and rode, not toward the main house, but away from Thorne's ranch, cutting across the open range toward the dark, silent shape of home. The Hale Creek Ranch was a skeleton under the stars. The house was dark, the corrals empty. And where the main barn had once stood was a jagged silhouette of charred timbers against the sky. The fire that had killed her father's horse, the accident that had killed him, had taken the barn with it. They moved into the wreckage, the air thick with the smell of old ash and sorrow. In the center of the ruins, half buried in debris, was the printing press, a hulking mass of rust-pocked iron. It was exactly where she remembered it. "He hid them here," she said, her voice echoing in the dead space. "He said the truth had to be anchored to something heavy." They didn't have shovels. They used their bare hands, digging into the compacted dirt and ash at the base of the massive machine. The work was grueling. Their fingers were raw, their faces smudged with soot, but desperation fueled them. After nearly an hour, Red Hawk's fingers struck something hard, metal. Working together, they cleared the remaining dirt and heaved. A small, tin lockbox, crusted with rust and earth, came free. The lock was rusted shut, but Red Hawk took a rock and, with a few short, sharp blows, broke it open. Eleanor lifted the lid. Her breath caught. It was filled with papers, miraculously preserved. They were her father's ammunition. There were signed receipts for payments made by Thorne to local officials. Threatening, unsigned letters sent to other small ranchers who had refused to sell their water rights. And underneath it all, a series of hand-drawn maps detailing the underground water table, the aquifers that fed every well and creek in the valley. Her father had been building a legal case against Thorne, proving that he was systematically and illegally choking the lifeblood of the entire territory. It was a treasure trove of evidence, enough to expose Thorne's corruption for all to see. They had his past crimes and his future plans. But as Red Hawk carefully examined the oldest document in the box, a copy of the original Spanish land grant for Hale Creek, his face grew taut. He traced the faded lines of the map with his finger, his brow furrowed in concentration. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. "Isn't this enough?" He looked up from the map, his eyes holding a new, urgent concern. He pointed to a small, circular mark on the centuries-old document, a symbol that was almost identical to the drawing she had seen in his notebook. He took out his notepad and wrote, the charcoal moving with grim speed, "This is a copy. The grant is only valid by the old Spanish law if the owner holds the celo de tierra, the earth seal, and presents it with a living witness at the source of the water." He looked at her, the weight of their near victory suddenly crushed by this final, impossible hurdle. They had the words, the maps, the proof of Thorne's evil. But without that one final piece, the physical symbol of the land's true history, their evidence was just paper. And in a land ruled by men like Thorne, paper could be burned as easily as a barn. The chapel in Saguaro Flats was not a house of God. It was a courtroom of public opinion. And on this day, it was largely empty. The heat was a physical presence, trapped within the timber walls, smelling of dry dust and brittle faith. The pews on the right side, reserved for the groom's party, were occupied by Elias Thorne, his foreman Cutter, and Judge Avery. They sat stiffly in their dark woolen suits, looking less like wedding guests and more like the board of a company overseeing a hostile acquisition. They were the civilized folk, the architects of this transaction. The pews on the left, for the bride's side, held a different congregation. Maria was there, her hands clutching a worn rosary, her face a study in stoic sorrow. Beside her sat Miguel, the old vaquero, his magnificent mustache drooping, his gnarled hands resting on his knees, his presence a silent testament of loyalty. And scattered in the back, standing like shadows against the wall, were 3 Apache men and an older woman Eleanor had never seen before. They were not from the reservation. They were the displaced, the remnants, drawn here by a loyalty that transcended fences and laws. They were the silent witnesses to the binding of one of their own. Eleanor stood at the front, beside the man she was about to marry. The dress she wore was her mother's, a simple gown of cream-colored cotton, washed so many times it was soft as a whisper. It was a ghost of a finer time, a fragile armor of memory against the harsh reality of the present. It was all she had left of her family's dignity. Red Hawk stood beside her, a man caged in civilization. Thorne had provided the suit, a black, ill-fitting garment that constricted his broad shoulders and seemed to rob him of his natural grace. It was a costume designed to make him look tame, but it only highlighted his wildness. His black hair, usually worn loose or in a simple tie, was slicked back and bound tightly at the nape of his neck. The severe style exposed the full, stark line of the scar on his face, a permanent record of the world's brutality. He did not look at the preacher. He stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the motes of dust dancing in the single shaft of light from a high window, his stillness a force more powerful than any sound in the room. The preacher, a nervous circuit rider with a thin, reedy voice, rushed through the ceremony. His words were hollow, the familiar phrases of love and devotion rendered meaningless by the cold truth of the arrangement. Eleanor felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a play about some other poor woman's life. Her own voice was a stranger's when she repeated her vows, a dry, rustling sound in the oppressive quiet. Then the preacher turned to Red Hawk. "Do you, Atsidi, take this woman, Eleanor, to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" Red Hawk did not answer immediately. The silence stretched, becoming taut and uncomfortable. Thorne shifted in his pew, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. And then, Red Hawk spoke. He spoke not in English, but in the low, guttural tones of his own tongue. The words were incomprehensible to most in the room, but they were not meant for them. The sound filled the small chapel, a resonant, ancient invocation that had nothing to do with the laws of the New Mexico territory. It was a vow made to his ancestors, to the land, to the woman standing beside him. It was the sound of a man claiming his own soul in the midst of his own sail, having spoken his truth. He turned his head slightly and looked at the preacher. His voice, when it came in English, was flat and devoid of emotion. "I do." It was an acceptance of the terms, not the marriage, a confirmation of the strategy, not the union. Eleanor understood. The Apache words were for her, for them. The English words were for Thorne. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher chirped. "Relieved to have reached the end, you may greet your bride." Before Red Hawk could move, Elias Thorne was on his feet. He strode forward, his hand extended not to the groom, but to Eleanor. He took her hand, his grip firm and cold, his thumb pressing down on her knuckles. It was not a congratulatory handshake. It was the sealing of a contract. He was the owner, taking possession of his newly acquired property. "Welcome to the family, my dear," he said, his voice a low purr of triumph. Eleanor pulled her hand free from his chilling grasp. She turned to her husband. He stood impassive, his dark eyes watching her, waiting. In that moment, she made a choice. She would not be a victim in this charade. She would be a combatant. She reached up, her hand gentle, and touched his face. She traced the line of his scar, from the temple down to the jaw, a map of his pain. Then, in front of Thorn, in front of the silent witnesses, she leaned in and pressed her lips to the center of that scar. The kiss was not one of passion. It was a vow, a silent declaration of allegiance. It was an acceptance of his wound, a promise to stand with him against the man who had inflicted it. It was a declaration of war, delivered in the guise of a bride's gentle kiss. She felt a tremor run through him, the barest flicker of surprise in the man who was surprised by nothing. When she pulled back, his eyes held a new light, a glimmer of something she had not seen before, a shared, dangerous understanding. As she turned away, her gaze swept over the pews, and the sight of the empty space on her side of the chapel hit her like a physical blow. Owen. He had not come. The seat where her brother should have been was a void, a dark, gaping wound in the already sparse crowd. The sacrifice she was making for him felt suddenly immense and terribly lonely. He was safe from the gallows, but at what cost to his own pride? To their bond, the empty chair was his answer. There was no reception, no celebration. The moment the ceremony was over, the small congregation dissolved. Thorn and his men left for the saloon to toast their victory. Maria and the vaqueros disappeared into the dusty streets. The Apache witnesses vanished as if they had never been there. A single wagon, loaded with Eleanor's few possessions, a trunk of clothes, a box of her mother's books, a few kitchen implements, stood waiting outside. Red Hawk loaded his own sparse belongings, the stack of notebooks, the woven basket, the wooden flute. They were husband and wife, and their new life was a wagon load of memories and secrets. The journey to Hale Creek was silent. Red Hawk handled the reins, his movements economical, his gaze sweeping the horizon, already back in his own world, the world of signs and portents. Eleanor sat beside him, the weight of the day settling upon her like a shroud. She was no longer Eleanor Hale. She was Mrs. Atsidi, a name she did not know, bound to a man she barely understood, on their way to a home that was about to become a battlefield. When they arrived, the scope of the task ahead was laid bare. The ranch was not just neglected, it was dying. The fences her father had so proudly built were sagging, with whole sections of wire snapped and lying in the dust. The small ranch house, once a place of warmth and comfort, looked skeletal, its paint peeled away by the relentless sun, a shutter hanging from a single hinge, and the well, the lifeblood of the entire property, had a deep, jagged crack running down its stone collar, a wound that mirrored the brokenness of their lives. Red Hawk pulled the wagon to a halt and sat for a long moment, his eyes taking in the decay. He was not seeing a failed ranch. He was reading the story of a slow, deliberate assault. He looked at the cracked wellhead, then at the distant line of Thorn's property, and a grim understanding passed over his face. He got down from the wagon and, without a word, walked directly to the charred ruins of the barn. Eleanor followed him. He did not look at the overall destruction. His focus was on the ground, his eyes scanning the ash and earth with an unnerving intensity. He moved around the perimeter of the foundation, his steps slow and measured. He crouched, his fingers brushing the ground, then stood and moved on. He did this 3 times, in 3 different spots around the edge of the ruin. Finally, he stopped and pointed. "Here," he said, his voice a low rasp. He pointed to a place where the ash was subtly different, the ground beneath it harder, more compacted than the surrounding area. And here, he indicated a second spot, 20 feet away. And here, the third spot, on the opposite side. "What is it?" she asked, though she already knew. The fire was set, he stated, not as a theory, but as a fact he was reading from the earth. 3 points. They used oil, poured it on the dry timber at the base. They wanted it to burn fast, to look like an accident, a stray spark in the hay. But a spark does not strike in 3 places at once. The cold reality of it settled in her stomach. Her father's death. It hadn't been a random tragedy, a spooked horse in a burning barn. It had been an execution. The fire had been a weapon, just as the false raid was meant to be. Thorn had not just ruined them, he had murdered her father. That night, they moved her things into the dusty, silent house. There were 2 small bedrooms. Without discussion, he took the smaller one, leaving her with her parents' old room. The division was a silent acknowledgement of the truth of their arrangement. They were allies, not husband and wife. Exhaustion pulled at her, a heavy, leaden weight. But sleep would not come. The house was filled with ghosts, with the echoes of laughter and love that now seemed a lifetime away. After an hour of staring into the darkness, she rose and went into the main room. A single candle burned on the small table. He had left it for her, and beside it, he had left one of his notebooks. It was open. She approached it hesitantly. It felt like a trespass, a violation of his fortress of silence. But he had not closed it. He had left it there, a silent invitation. She looked down at the page. It was filled with the same symbol she had seen before, the circular seal, drawn over and over again. Celo de tierra, the earth seal. Seeing it now, knowing what it was, knowing it was the missing key to their survival, transformed it. It was no longer a strange, abstract drawing. Each line, each curve, was imbued with a desperate, urgent meaning. It was the mark of his people, the proof of her father's claim, the one thing that stood between them and annihilation. The obsessive, repeated drawings were not a simple sketch. They were a prayer, a mantra, a map of the secret he had been forced to carry, alone, in silence, for years. The weight of that secret, she now realized, was a burden she had just promised to share. Before the sun had risen, in the deep blue twilight that precedes the dawn, he came for her. There was no knock. She simply sensed his presence outside her door, a stillness that was different from the stillness of the night. When she opened it, he was there with the white stallion and her bay, already saddled. He didn't speak, just nodded toward the hills, a silent summons she now understood. They rode away from the skeletal remains of Hale Creek, leaving the broken fences and the cracked well behind. He led her into a labyrinth of arroyos and canyons she had never known existed, a landscape that was just a blur of brown and gray from a distance, but was intricate and full of life up close. He moved through it with the certainty of a man walking through the rooms of his own house. After an hour, as the sky began to bleed with the first pale colors of morning, they arrived at Mesa de Lobo. It was a flat-topped rock formation, a massive table of stone that rose from the desert floor, its sheer cliffs carved by millennia of wind and water. It commanded a view of the entire valley, including the dry, winding scar of what had once been a flowing riverbed. It felt like a place outside of time, an altar built by the earth itself. He dismounted and led her on foot to the very edge of the mesa. The rock beneath her boots was smooth, almost polished, and etched with faint markings that might have been carvings or simply the tracks of ancient water. He walked to a specific spot near the cliff edge, a place that looked no different from any other, and knelt. From a leather pouch at his belt, he took 3 small bundles. He unwrapped the first, revealing a fine gray clay. The second held a black powder she recognized as ash. The third contained a chunk of amber-colored resin from a piñón pine, sticky and fragrant. He produced a small bowl carved from a gourd and, with methodical grace, began to mix the ingredients. He added a few drops of water from a canteen, working the mixture with his fingers until it became a thick, dark mud, the color of a stormy sky. The process was a ritual, each movement deliberate and imbued with a significance that went far beyond the simple act of mixing mud. With the mixture prepared, he began to clear a small, circular patch of the smooth rock at his knees. He brushed away the dust with the palm of his hand, his touch both firm and gentle. Then, from another pouch, the one he wore close to his heart, he withdrew the source of the drawings in his notebook. It was not a drawing, but an object, a round, flat piece of carved ironwood, dark and heavy, its surface covered in an intricate, interlocking pattern. It was the mold, the seal itself. Seeing the real thing after staring at its image for so long made Eleanor's breath catch. It felt impossibly ancient, a key to a history she had never known. He held the wooden mold for a moment, his thumb tracing its worn edges. Then, with a slow, steady pressure, he pressed it into the center of the dark mud he had prepared. He held it there, his eyes closed, his lips moving in a silent prayer or incantation. When he lifted it, the impression left behind in the clay was perfect, a raised, circular pattern that seemed to shimmer in the low morning light. It was a sun and a river and the lines of the earth all woven together. It was a full moon rising over the dark land. It was the cielo de tierra. He sat back on his heels, his work complete, and stared at the seal's fresh imprint on the stone. He finally looked at her, and the walls of his silence seemed to crumble, not in a torrent, but just enough for the truth to escape. His voice was a low rasp, each word costing him an enormous effort. Cielo de tierra, the earth seal. He touched the wooden mold. My father was its keeper. It was given to his grandfather by the first Mexican family to hold this valley, the Montoyas, a promise. It is the water deed, from the time of the Spanish kings. The history of the valley, a history she had thought began with settlers like her father, was suddenly rewritten, stretching back centuries. He looked away, his gaze turning inward to a place of shadow and pain. When the soldiers came, when my people were scattered, it was lost in the fighting. His hand unconsciously went to the scar on his face. I was a boy. I found it in the ashes. I came back here. He touched the flat rock beneath them. I buried it. Here, beneath this stone. I made a drawing of it on paper, a copy, and buried that too. I kept the real one. His voice dropped to a whisper, filled with the ghosts of that terrible day, and I did not speak again. The weight of his confession settled over her. His silence had not been a choice made in defiance of Thorn. It had been born here, on this rock, a vow made to a murdered family and a lost history. He had buried his past, his heritage, and his voice, all in the same sacred ground. He pointed from the imprint on the rock down to the dry riverbed below, which ran directly toward Hale Creek. The law of the Spanish grant is old, but it is still the law, the one who holds the cello and makes its mark in the earth at the source of the spring, with a living witness to the original pact. That person holds the rights to the water, all of it. The implications of his words struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was the key, the one thing that could legally and absolutely shatter Thorn's entire empire, which was built on the water he stole. It wasn't just a moral claim. It was a legal one, rooted in a law older than the United States itself. It was the ultimate checkmate. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingertips hovering over the wooden mold he still held. It was warm from his touch. This small, beautiful object was the secret that could save her land, restore his people's honor, and bring justice for her father. It was the reason he had agreed to Thorn's bargain, why he had endured the humiliation. He had not agreed to be her handcuff. He had agreed to use their union to bring his secret out of the earth. He had needed a reason, a trigger, and she, with her fight for Hale Creek, had become that reason. The shield, he had called her, a shield for his secret. "This will save us," she whispered, her voice filled with a fragile, dawning awe. "This will save everything." A shadow crossed his face. The hope that had flared between them was instantly tempered by a harsh reality. He looked at her, his eyes filled with the burden of the final, most difficult piece of the puzzle. "We need the witness," he said. "The law requires a living memory of the pact, a Montoya." "But the Montoyas, they're gone, aren't they?" she asked, the hope beginning to drain away. "Thorn drove them all out, or—" "One is left," he said, "Don Rafael Montoya. He was a young man when my grandfather and his father reaffirmed the pact. His signature is on the original grant document your father had." He saw the cello with his own eyes. Red Hawk's expression was grim. After Thorn's men burned his home, he fled. He lives in hiding, in Laguna. Laguna. The pueblo was 100 miles away, across a harsh and unforgiving landscape patrolled by both Thorne's riders and army patrols who would shoot an Apache on sight, no questions asked. It was a perilous, almost impossible journey. As the full weight of the task settled upon them, a profound silence enveloped the mesa. The sun had risen higher, casting their long shadows across the stone. The decision was unspoken but absolute. It was the only way. Red Hawk stood, his body language shifting from the quiet reverence of the keeper of the seal to the focused intensity of the tracker. The warrior. His path was clear. "I will go," he said. It was not a question or a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. "I will find Don Rafael. I will bring him back." At that exact moment, miles away in the sterile comfort of his office, Elias Thorne poured himself a glass of whiskey. His foreman, Cutter, stood before the desk, his hat in his hands. "The wedding is done," Thorne said, his voice smooth as the polished wood of his desk. "They're out at that wreck of a ranch, playing house. It's time." Cutter nodded. "The boys are ready. The paint and feathers are in the saddlebags. When do you want us to ride?" Thorne took a slow sip of his whiskey, savoring the taste of his victory. Give them 2 nights to feel safe. Let the bride get used to her new life. Then, on the 3rd night, before the moon rises, you ride. Burn the barn to the ground this time. Make a lot of noise. But do not harm the girl or the tracker. I want them to be terrified survivors, running to me for protection. He set his glass down with a decisive click. Go, get it done. Back on the mesa, the 2 worlds, the 2 missions, were set on an irreversible collision course. Red Hawk gathered his things, his movements swift and purposeful. He was leaving, riding toward a faint hope buried in the past. And Eleanor was to stay, to keep watch over a home that was now the target of a carefully orchestrated lie, a stage being set for a final, violent act. The clock had started ticking. There was no farewell. He was simply gone. As the first light touched the eastern peaks, Eleanor watched from the doorway of the derelict house as the white stallion, a ghostly figure in the dimness, moved fluidly into the broken lands. Red Hawk rode not like a man on a horse, but like an extension of the animal's will, a part of the desert landscape reasserting its claim. He did not look back. Their alliance was forged in necessity, not sentiment. Looking back was a luxury neither of them could afford. He moved north, through a maze of arroyos and across plains dotted with the stark, reaching arms of yucca plants. The land was an open book to him, but it was a book written in a dangerous language. He avoided the main trails, the arteries of Thorne's influence, and the distant, dusty tracks used by army patrols from Fort Stanton. He knew their routes, their timing, the places they stopped for water. He had been their scout, their tool, and now he used that knowledge against them, a ghost moving through the gaps in their awareness. The white stallion, bred for speed and stamina, moved tirelessly beneath him, its hooves making only a soft puffing sound in the deep dust, a whisper of passage where another horse would have left a shout. Back at Hale Creek, the silence he left behind was a heavy, suffocating blanket, but Eleanor could not afford to be still. The countdown had begun. 3 nights. She found Maria in the small kitchen, her face a mask of grim resolve. "He is gone," the housekeeper asked, though it was not a question. "To find the witness," Eleanor confirmed. "We have 2 days to prepare." Maria nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "Miguel will come. The others too. The ones who remember what Thorne did to their families." And they did come. By midday, a small handful of vaqueros, men whose loyalty to Thorne was a matter of wages, not heart, had quietly slipped away from the main ranch and arrived at Hale Creek. They were led by Miguel, the old man with the sad, wise eyes. They brought with them their own tools, their own resolve. There were no grand speeches. There was only work. Eleanor, who had spent her life trying to hold the ranch together with fading hopes and patched-up plans, found herself at the center of this quiet rebellion. She was no longer just fighting for her brother or her land. She was fighting alongside a small, determined band of the dispossessed. She worked beside them, her hands, already calloused, soon becoming raw and blistered. They did not treat her like a fragile lady. They treated her like a commander. They reinforced the sagging fences, not to keep cattle in, but to create obstacles, to slow a charge. They filled every barrel, every trough, every bucket with water from the cracked well, positioning them near the house and the outbuildings, not for drinking, but for dousing flames. Miguel, his movements slow but deliberate, showed her how to create makeshift choke points, how to use the terrain to their advantage. "Let them think the front door is the only way," he said, his voice a low rumble, "while we wait for them from the windows." They planned escape routes, a path through the gully behind the house that led to the broken country where a horse and rider could vanish. They prepared for a siege, turning their dilapidated home into a fortress of desperation. On the evening of the first day, as the sun set, casting long, bloody shadows across the valley, a lone rider approached. It wasn't one of the vaqueros. Eleanor's hand went to the Colt peacemaker tucked into her waistband, the cold weight of it a constant, grim reminder of her new reality. The rider came closer, his posture slumped in the saddle, the posture of a defeated man. It was Owen. He slid from his horse before it had even stopped, his face pale and smudged with dirt. He looked at the repaired fences, at the grim-faced vaqueros, at the sister he had not seen since the day of the trial. Shame was a physical weight on his shoulders. "Ellie," he began, his voice cracking, Thorne let me go. This morning. He said you'd made the bargain. He said I was free. He couldn't meet her eyes. I'm sorry. I never should have. I was a fool. I should have been at the wedding. I'm so sorry." Tears of relief and sorrow pricked at Eleanor's eyes. She put her arms around her brother, her foolish, brave, hot-headed brother, and held him tight. "It's all right, Owen. You're here now. That's what matters." He pulled back, his young face hardened by a new, terrible knowledge. "That's not all. I have to tell you. I heard them talking in town, at the saloon. Thorne's men. They were celebrating. Cutter was buying rounds, telling everyone what a fine new bride the Apache tracker had." He took a shaky breath. "They're saying there's been Apache signs seen up in the hills. They're stirring up fear. And they said the army is stretched thin, and it's up to good folk to protect themselves. The attack, they're planning it for the third night. Tomorrow." The rumor was the final piece of the trap, the justification Thorne was seeding among the populace. Owen's news was not a surprise, but a confirmation. The clock was ticking even faster than they had thought. Hundreds of miles away, Red Hawk was riding into the dusty outskirts of Laguna Pueblo. The ancient city of stacked adobe homes rose from the desert like a natural extension of the earth. He did not ride in openly. He left the stallion in a hidden cove and entered on foot, a shadow moving through other shadows. He asked no questions, drew no attention. He listened. He watched. He searched for a ghost. He found him in a small, dark room behind a weaver's shop, a place that smelled of chili and old wool. Don Rafael Montoya was not the proud patriarch Red Hawk remembered from his childhood. He was an old man, his back bent, his hair a shock of white. A thick, milky cataract covered his left eye, leaving him half blind. He sat on a low stool, his hands, knotted with age, resting on a cane. Red Hawk entered the room and stood before him in silence. The old man's one good eye, a piercing, intelligent brown, narrowed. He studied the tall, silent figure. "I know you," Don Rafael said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "You are the son of DeSoto High, the boy who ran with the wolves. They call you Red Hawk now." Red Hawk gave a slight nod. From the pouch he wore next to his heart, he carefully withdrew the celo de tierra and held it out. The old man squinted, leaning forward. His good eye was not sharp enough to make out the details. "What is this?" Red Hawk knelt before him and gently placed the wooden seal into the old man's hands. Don Rafael's gnarled fingers closed around it. He held it, weighed it, his thumb tracing the smooth, worn surface. He ran his fingertips over the intricate carvings, his touch a language more certain than sight. His hand stopped, his thumb finding a small, almost imperceptible fissure near the outer edge. A deep, shuddering breath escaped the old man's lips. La grieta del juramento, he whispered, the crack of the oath. He looked up, his one good eye wide with a dawning, incredulous light. My father's thumb slipped. The day he and your grandfather last sealed the pact, he called it a mark of human imperfection in a divine promise. He clutched the seal to his chest. I thought it was dust. I thought it was ash and memory. After all these years. Red Hawk explained, his words spare and direct. The story of Thorn, of the land, of Hale Creek and the woman who now fought for it. Don Raphael listened, his face a mask of sorrow and then a slow, burning anger. Elias Thorn, he spat the name like a poison. He is a plague. He took everything, but he did not take our honor. He rose, his movements stiff but filled with a new purpose. He went to an old, iron-strapped chest in the corner, and from it, he retrieved a piece of parchment, an inkwell, and a quill, and from a small velvet bag, he took a heavy silver seal bearing the Montoya family crest. His hand shook, but his words, as he wrote in the elegant, looping script of his youth, were firm. He wrote not in English, but in the formal Spanish of the original grant, citing the old laws, the date of the original pact, and his personal, witnessed testimony that the man called Atsidi, son of Dasoda High, was the true keeper of the Celo de Tierra. He signed it, then dripped hot, red wax onto the bottom of the parchment and pressed his family seal into it with a final, definitive thud. He handed the document to Red Hawk. "This is our truth," he said. "Go, ride with God." But Thorn's reach was long. As Red Hawk left Laguna, he sensed them. Two riders, keeping their distance, but their intent as sharp as a knife in the air. A pursuit had been arranged. He urged the white stallion into a gallop, not toward home, but deeper into the Badlands, a twisted maze of rock and shadow. He led them a desperate chase for hours, pushing the horse to its limits. Finally, as they closed in, he veered sharply into a narrow slot canyon, a deep, winding crack in the earth barely wide enough for a single horse. He dismounted, quieting the stallion with a touch and a whisper. He pressed himself into a fissure in the rock wall, the precious document and the cello tucked safely inside his shirt. The riders slowed at the canyon mouth, wary of an ambush. Red Hawk pulled a small, polished copper disc from his pouch, a signal mirror. He waited. When one of the riders edged his horse forward, Red Hawk angled the mirror, catching the harsh afternoon sun and flashing a blinding reflection off a rock wall deep within the canyon. "He's in there!" the rider shouted. They spurred their horses forward, firing their rifles into the canyon, the shots echoing like thunder in the enclosed space. Red Hawk waited until they had passed his hiding spot. Then he emerged, silent as the rock itself. He leaped onto the stallion's back and galloped out of the canyon's mouth, back the way he had come, leaving his pursuers to chase a phantom of reflected light. That night, the second night, Eleanor stood watch on the porch of the Hale Creek house. The vaqueros were posted at the windows. Owen was in the stable, a rifle across his knees. The tension was a living thing, a predator stalking them from the darkness. Suddenly, a sound drifted across the plains, faint and hauntingly familiar. The pure, sad notes of a wooden flute. It was a signal. He was close. Relief washed through her, so powerful it made her knees weak. But before she could even savor it, another sound answered from the low hills to the north. It was a high, ululating cry, a grotesque imitation of an Apache war whoop. It was a taunt, a promise. They were out there. They were listening, and they were waiting. The chase had cost him precious time. Red Hawk rode through the night, the stallion's white coat a beacon under the thin light of the stars. He pushed on, exhaustion a dull ache in his bones. His mind focused on one thing, getting back before the third night fell. He was less than a mile from the ranch, riding through a thick patch of mesquite. When the rifle shot cracked through the night, he felt a searing, white-hot pain slice across his left shoulder. He cried out, nearly falling from the saddle. He flattened himself against the stallion's neck, urging the horse into a desperate, final sprint. Another shot whizzed past his ear. He burst out of the mesquite and into the open, the dark shape of the Hale Creek house visible in the distance. He could hear shouting behind him. He clung to the stallion's mane, the world tilting and blurring, his arm a useless, burning weight. He half fell, half slid from the horse as it reached the yard, stumbling to his knees. Owen and Eleanor were there in an instant, pulling him to his feet, dragging him toward the house. He staggered through the doorway and collapsed against the table, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hand fumbled inside his shirt, pulling out the precious roll of parchment and the heavy, wooden cello. As he laid them on the table, a drop of his own dark blood fell from his wounded shoulder, landing directly in the center of the earth seal, a final, crimson offering. He looked up at Eleanor, his face pale and strained with pain. The countdown was over. The third night had begun. The world was torn open by a scream. It was a sound of manufactured savagery, a chorus of high-pitched, ululating cries that were a grotesque mockery of the real thing. Eleanor was at a side window, a rifle clutched in her hands, her knuckles white. The first sign of the attack wasn't a sound, but a flicker of orange against the deep, star-dusted indigo of the sky just before dawn. They came on horseback, a dozen riders emerging from the darkness like demons from a crack in the earth. They were painted, their faces streaked with clumsy lines of black and red. Feathers were tied haphazardly in their hair and to their horses' manes. It was a child's nightmare of an Apache war party, and in its crude theatricality, it was utterly terrifying. They were not aiming for the house. They were charging the small, dry-rotted stable where Owen had taken shelter. One rider, a large man at the front, held a burning torch high, its flames licking at the night. He galloped toward the stable, his intention clear. The dry, ancient timber would go up like a tinderbox. "Hold your fire." Miguel's voice was a low, steady rumble beside Eleanor. He stood at the next window, his old Winchester as still as if it were carved from the same block of wood as the window frame. "They are drunk on noise and fire. They think we are sleeping sheep. Let them come closer. Let them see the price of every foot of this ground." The air was filled with whoops and shouts. The man with the torch reached the stable, leaning from his saddle to thrust the flames into a pile of dry hay stacked against the wall. The hay ignited with a hungry whoosh, the flames climbing the wooden wall in an instant, painting the entire yard in a flickering, hellish light. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rising roar of the fire. She could see Owen, a small figure silhouetted against the flames, beating at the fire with a horse blanket. Maria was already there, a bucket of precious water in her hand, her small form a study in frantic, fearless motion. Eleanor raised the rifle to her shoulder, the stock pressing hard against the bone. She found the man with the torch in her sights. He had pulled his horse back and was laughing, his painted face a demonic mask in the firelight, watching his handiwork. The memory of Red Hawk's words whispered in her mind, "Only shoot when there is room for regret." There was no room for anything but a cold, hard certainty. She let out a slow breath, the way he had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her, the sound of the shot shockingly loud. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The man with the torch stopped laughing. A dark spot appeared on his chest. He looked down, a comical expression of surprise on his face. Then he swayed in the saddle and toppled to the ground like a sack of grain. A wave of nausea washed over her. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She had just shot a man. But through the trembling, a different feeling rose, a grim, steely resolve. She had not fired in anger. She had fired to protect her home, her brother, her allies. She took another breath, forced her hands to steady, and worked the lever on the rifle, chambering a new round. She held her aim, waiting for the next target. Her shot had broken their spell of invincibility. The whooping and shouting faltered. Two other riders who were preparing their own torches suddenly spurred their horses back into the shadows. Miguel fired, his shot taking another rider's horse out from under him. The man went down in a tangle of limbs, screaming. Owen, seeing his chance, had managed to beat back the worst of the flames on the stable wall. Maria was there, throwing a mixture of salt and ash from a sack onto the base of the fire. a trick to smother the flames that her grandmother had taught her. The stable was saved. For now. The attackers, enraged and confused, regrouped. Their leader, a man whose face was hidden in shadow but whose bulk was unmistakable, barked an order. It was Cutter. He pointed toward the house. "Forget the barn, get the girl." Their strategy shifted. They dismounted, using their horses for cover, and began to advance on the house itself, their rifles spitting fire into the darkness. Bullets thudded into the thick adobe walls, sending chips of dried mud flying. One shattered a window pane, spraying glass across the floor. "The north door," Miguel shouted. "They will try to break it down." 4 of the attackers, including Cutter, broke from cover and made a mad dash for the heavy oak door on the north side of the house, the one least covered by the windows. They carried a heavy log between them, a makeshift battering ram. Just as they reached the porch, a new sound cut through the cacophony of gunfire and shouting. It was a single, pure note, rising from the small rock outcropping that overlooked the ranch, the sound of a wooden flute. The melody was clear and piercing, a lament that seemed to suck the rage out of the air. The attackers faltered, their eyes turning toward the sound. For a moment, everyone, attacker and defender alike, was frozen by the strange, haunting music. Then the music stopped, and from the rocks came a voice, not shouting, but speaking in the Apache tongue, the words carrying with an unnatural clarity in the pre-dawn air. It was Red Hawk. Eleanor couldn't understand the words, but she understood their effect. The attackers, who had been playing a grotesque game, were now confronted with the real thing, and they were terrified. As they stood confused, 2 figures rose from the darkness on the eastern flank of the house. They were Apache, lean and swift, armed with rifles. They had moved into position with the silence of ghosts. They opened fire, their shots precise and deadly. One of the men preparing the battering ram cried out and fell, clutching his leg. Cutter and his remaining men were caught in a vice. They had the defenders in the house in front of them, and this new, terrifying threat on their flank. They turned, firing wildly toward the 2 Apache scouts. But as they did, a third figure appeared on the rock outcropping. It was Red Hawk. He stood silhouetted against the lightening sky, a rifle in his good hand. He fired once. A second man carrying the battering ram went down. The fake war party dissolved into a panic-stricken mob. All pretense of a disciplined attack was gone. They were just hired men, paid to be bullies, not soldiers. They scrambled for their horses, firing blindly over their shoulders as they fled back into the darkness. 3 of them, their horses shot or fled, were left exposed in the yard. They threw their rifles down, raising their hands high above their heads. "Don't shoot," one of them screamed, his voice cracking with terror. "We give up, we'll talk." Silence descended upon the yard, as sudden and absolute as the initial chaos had been. The only sounds were the crackling of the dying fire, the groans of the wounded man, and the ragged breathing of the survivors. Red Hawk and his 2 allies, their faces grim and businesslike, came down from the rocks, efficiently disarming the men who had surrendered. Owen and the vaqueros emerged from the house, their rifles still ready. In the center of it all, Eleanor stood on the porch, the heavy Colt still in her hand. The night of terror was over. The trap had been sprung, but they had refused to be the prey. She looked at the wounded, at the men who had surrendered, at the smoldering wall of her stable, and she felt a surge of something powerful, something she had not felt in years. It was the feeling of ownership, of a right that had been defended and paid for in blood and terror. She turned and walked back into the house. Her eyes fell on the table, where the Celo de Tierra lay next to the Montoya document. The drop of Red Hawk's blood was a dark, defiant star in its center. She picked up the heavy wooden seal, its weight a solid, comforting presence in her shaking hand. She walked out of the house, past the surrendered men, to the one place that represented the heart of their struggle, the cracked well. The ground around it was damp, a patch of dark mud in the dusty yard. She knelt, her mother's dress trailing in the dirt, and with all the strength that was in her, she pressed the earth seal into the mud. The ancient pattern emerged, sharp and clear in the first light of dawn. She stood and faced the men, her voice ringing out in the quiet morning air. clear and strong. "This is marked land," she declared, her voice resonating with an authority she did not know she possessed. "This water belongs to Hale Creek. This water belongs to us." One of the captured men, a torch held by a vaquero illuminating his face, began to laugh. It was a harsh, ugly sound. It was Cutter, Thorne's foreman, his face smeared with sweat and paint, a bleeding gash on his forehead. He looked at the seal in the mud, then at Eleanor's defiant face, and his laugh turned into a sneer. "You think that little mud pie means anything?" he spat. "You think you've won?" He shook his head, a look of pitying contempt in his eyes. "You stupid girl. You haven't won a thing. You've just declared war on his law." The courthouse in Santa Rosa was built of stone, not wood. It was a place designed to convey the permanence of the law, a stark contrast to the makeshift justice of Saguaro Flats. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation and the scent of dust, sweat, and oiled leather. On a raised platform sat Judge Avery, his face pale and grim, flanked by a stern-faced district attorney and 2 armed military policemen, their brass buttons gleaming. This was not a territorial hearing. It was a federal inquiry, and the stakes had been raised to a level that made the entire valley hold its breath. Elias Thorne did not look like a man on trial. He looked like a king holding court. He sat at a polished table with 3 men in expensive Eastern suits, lawyers whose faces were smooth and whose eyes were cold. He was the picture of calm, untouchable power, a man who believed the law was simply another one of his assets, to be managed and leveraged like land or cattle. The district attorney, a man named Garrett, began not with accusations, but with history. He called his first witness. "The court calls Don Rafael Montoya." The old man was led to the stand by Miguel, his steps shuffling and uncertain. He was a relic from another time, a living ghost in this world of sharp angles and legal maneuvering. One of his hands trembled violently as he was sworn in. But when he began to speak, his voice, though frail, was filled with the unshakable authority of memory. He held the sworn affidavit in his trembling hand, but he did not read from it. He spoke from the heart, in the rich, formal Spanish of his ancestors, his one good eye fixed on Judge Avery. An official court interpreter translated, his flat, professional tone a stark contrast to the old man's passionate words. "I was there," Don Rafael said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "I saw it with my own eyes. My father and the Apache chief, Da Soda High, on the stone of the mesa. They made the mark with the Celo de Tierra. They spoke of the pact. The water of the creek, the water under the ground, was to be shared, a gift of God for all the people of this valley, held in trust by the keepers of the seal. This was the law. It was the law before this courthouse was stone, before this territory had a name." He raised a shaking finger and pointed it at Thorne. "This man's claim is a lie written on stolen paper. The Hale Creek Grant, and the water that feeds it, is protected by a law of honor that is older and truer than any fence he has ever built." When he finished, a profound silence held the room. He had not presented evidence. He had delivered a benediction for a world that Thorne had tried to erase. Next came the hired guns, the 2 men who had surrendered. They were no longer fearsome raiders, just grubby, frightened men facing a long time in a federal prison. Their testimony was simple, brutal, and damning. They spoke of being paid in gold coin by Cutter, of the paint and feathers supplied from Thorne's own storeroom, and of the explicit orders: burn the Hale barn, create terror, and make it look like an Apache raid. Who gave Cutter these orders? The district attorney asked the first man. The man swallowed hard, refusing to look at Thorne. "Mr. Thorne himself," he mumbled. "He told us to make it look real. He said the girl and the tracker were to be left alive, to be witnesses to their own ruin." Then Red Hawk was called to the stand. He moved with a quiet dignity, his arm in a sling beneath his simple cotton shirt. He took the oath, his voice low and steady. He did not speak of grievances or injustices. He spoke of facts. He recited dates, names, and locations. He described missions Thorne had sent him on, not to harm men, but to map their land, to find their hidden springs, to track their movements before they were conveniently bought out or met with accidents. He laid out the intricate web of Thorne's intelligence gathering, the systematic way he targeted any rancher who stood between him and total control of the water table. He spoke without emotion, his testimony a flat, chilling ledger of his employer's greed. Thorne's lead lawyer, a man with a silver mane and a condescending smirk, rose for his cross-examination. He did not challenge the facts. He attacked the man. "You are an Apache, are you not, Mr. Atsidi?" he began, dripping the name with scorn. "I am," Red Hawk replied. "And you have, in the past, served as a scout for the United States Army, a position from which you were dismissed under a cloud of suspicion, accused of leading a patrol into a fatal ambush." "I was accused," Red Hawk said, his voice unchanging. "So," the lawyer said, turning to address the judge in the room, "we are asked to accept the word of a man whose own people are at war with our government, a man whose loyalty is, by his very nature, suspect. We are asked to believe the elaborate tales of a disgraced scout, a savage telling stories to save his own skin." He paused for effect. "Your Honor, the testimony of such a man is, I submit, fundamentally and entirely worthless." Red Hawk did not react. He did not rise to the bait. He simply reached into a leather satchel at his feet and produced one of his notebooks. He opened it and laid it on the witness stand. "What is this?" the lawyer asked with a dismissive wave. "A diary, a book of native fables." "It is a record," Red Hawk said. He turned the book so the judge could see. The page was not filled with words, but with a meticulously hand-drawn map. It showed the watercourses, both above and below ground, for the entire valley. It was marked with symbols, a key for which was neatly drawn in the margin, a small circle for a new well, a cross for a spring that had been illegally dammed, a triangle for a supply drop for Thorne's men. There were dates, coordinates, and notations, all in his clean, spare script. It was the secret anatomy of Thorne's empire. "My words may be suspect," Red Hawk said, his eyes locking with the lawyer's. "The earth is not—" The room murmured. The lawyer was momentarily speechless. He had tried to corner a wolf and had found himself facing a cartographer. Before he could recover, the district attorney called his final witness. "The court calls Eleanor Hale." Eleanor walked to the stand, her heart pounding. She carried two things, the cello de tierra and a small, canvas-wrapped bundle. She was sworn in, and then she turned to the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Mr. Thorne and his lawyer have spoken of lies and worthless words. I wish to present something that does not lie." She unwrapped the bundle, revealing the slab of dried mud she had pressed the seal into. The circular pattern was sharp and clear. Then, she placed the cello de tierra itself on the judge's bench. The heavy, dark ironwood seemed to absorb all the light in the room, its ancient presence a silent, powerful rebuke to the cheap suits and legal tricks. "This is the cello de tierra, the earth seal of the Hale Creek land grant," she announced. Thorne's lawyer leaped to his feet. "Objection! This is absurd. A piece of wood and a mud pie. This is not evidence. It is theater." "It is evidence, Your Honor," the district attorney countered calmly. "And we have verification." He nodded to the court clerk, who came forward with a glass photographic plate. "At my request, a deputy was sent to Mesa de Lobo this morning to photograph the impression made in the rock, as described by the witness, Don Rafael Montoya." The clerk held the plate up to the light. On it was the ghostly black and white image of the seal's imprint on the flat stone of the mesa. It was a perfect, undeniable match to the pattern on the wooden seal and the imprint in the dried mud. The three artifacts, the seal, the proof of its use at the well, and the photograph of its historical resting place formed an unbreakable chain of evidence. A truth told in wood, earth, and light. And the courtroom was utterly silent. Every eye was on Judge Avery. He was a man trapped. He could side with the power and money of Elias Thorne, the man who owned him, and in doing so, make a mockery of the very law he represented in front of a federal attorney and military police. Or he could uphold the evidence, a weight of truth so heavy it could not be ignored. He stared at the cello de tierra. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the pale, furious face of Elias Thorne. He picked up his gavel. His hand was shaking. He brought it down with a crack that made everyone in the room jump. "This court," he said, his voice hoarse, "recognizes the legitimacy of the celo de tierra and the primacy of the Spanish land grant concerning the water rights of the property known as Hale Creek." A collective gasp went through the room. "Furthermore," Avery continued, his voice gaining strength, "based on the testimony provided, this court finds sufficient cause to issue a warrant for the immediate arrest of Mr. Elias Thorne on the charges of conspiracy to commit murder, land fraud, and the unlawful appropriation of federal water resources." The mask of civility finally shattered. As the two military policemen moved toward him, Thorne surged to his feet, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unrestrained fury. His expensive lawyers backed away from him as if he were a rabid dog. "You fools!" he roared, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "You can't do this! I own this valley! I own all of you!" He struggled as the policeman grabbed his arms, his body trembling with rage. He looked past the judge, past the lawyers, his venomous gaze settling on Eleanor and Red Hawk. "You think you've won," he screamed, his voice raw. "You'll die of thirst. I'll see this whole valley turn to dust before you get a single drop. You'll all die of thirst." They dragged him, still shouting, from the courtroom. As the doors slammed shut behind him, cutting off his curses, a stunned silence fell, followed by an explosion of excited chatter. Eleanor stood, her legs feeling weak. She looked at Red Hawk, who watched the doors close with a quiet, somber intensity. Then she turned her gaze to where Thorne had just been, his final desperate curse still ringing in the air. She looked at the judge, at the people of the valley who had lived in fear for so long, and she spoke, her voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the room. "Water," she said, her eyes clear and unwavering, "belongs to the truth." The doors of the stone courthouse slammed shut, and the dam of silence broke. A roar went through the room, a wave of sound that was not cheering, but the explosive release of years of compressed fear. Men turned to each other, their faces a mixture of shock, calculation, and a wild, dawning opportunism. They were not celebrating justice for Eleanor Hale or the Apache. They were celebrating the fall of a king. The truth finally had a paper warrant, a legal stamp, and that was a truth they could understand, a truth they could profit from. The order of the world had been broken, and in the chaos, new fortunes could be made. In the center of the storm, the adrenaline that had held Red Hawk upright finally drained away, the strength that had powered his testimony, that had allowed him to face down the lawyer's scorn, vanished, and all that was left was the man, wounded and exhausted. He swayed on his feet, a sudden pallor spreading beneath his sun-darkened skin, the searing pain in his shoulder, which he had walled off behind his fortress of silence, crashed through his defenses. He gritted his teeth, his hand instinctively going to the sling. Eleanor saw it instantly. She moved to his side, her own exhaustion forgotten. She slid her shoulder under his good arm, taking his weight. It was a surprising, solid weight, the weight of a man made of muscle and bone and a resilience that was now failing him. He leaned on her, a silent admission of his vulnerability. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice a firm anchor in the swirling chaos of the room. She looked at the judge's bench, where the celo de tierra lay next to the official court documents, an ancient, dark presence amidst the flimsy paper. She walked to the bench, picked up the heavy wooden seal, and returned to Red Hawk's side. She took his hand, the one that was not in the sling, and gently placed the cello into his palm. His fingers, long and calloused, closed around it, a reflexive, possessive gesture. He was reclaiming the soul he had buried. "This secret," she said, her voice low and fierce, "for him alone. It saved us all." He looked down at the wood in his hand, then at her, his dark eyes filled with a universe of pain and history. They made their way through the throng of people who parted before them, their faces a sea of curiosity and awe. They were no longer just a homesteader's daughter and a half-wild tracker. They were the architects of an earthquake. As they stepped out of the courthouse and into the blinding New Mexico sun, he faltered again. She held him steady, her grip firm on his arm. He leaned against the stone wall of the courthouse, taking a deep, ragged breath. He looked at the cello clutched in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. He spoke, and it was the longest he had ever spoken, his voice a low, rough whisper, each word excavated from a deep and silent place. "I buried it, to survive," he said. His gaze locked on hers. "You dug it up, to live right." The simple truth of it settled between them, more profound than any vow. It was the story of their alliance, of their two worlds colliding to form a new one. She had no words to answer, only a look of complete, unvarnished understanding. The ride back to Hale Creek was a journey through a transformed world. The land itself seemed to have exhaled a breath it had been holding for a decade. The air felt lighter. The colors of the desert, the deep red of the earth and the pale green of the sagebrush, seemed sharper, more vibrant. As they crested the final rise and saw the small, battered ranch house nestled in the valley below, the sky began to change. Great, bruised purple clouds, heavy with moisture, were rolling in from the west. A sight so rare in this season it felt like a miracle. The wind shifted, carrying with it the clean, electric scent of ozone. By the time they reached the yard, the first fat drop of rain struck the dusty ground, leaving a dark, star-shaped mark, then another, and then the heavens opened. It was not a gentle shower, but a deluge, a cleansing, soul-quenching downpour that hammered on the roof of the house and turned the dusty yard into a sheet of running water. They stood on the porch for a moment, watching it, the sound a roaring applause from the sky. This was the blessing the land had been denied for so long. Eleanor watched as a small rivulet of water began to form, flowing through the yard, finding its path. It ran directly over the spot near the cracked well where she had pressed the seal into the mud. The water filled the circular impression, shimmering in the gray light. A perfect, clear lens of water held within the mark of the earth. It was as if the sky itself was signing the deed, approving the pact with its life-giving signature. Owen came out of the house, his face washed clean of the fear and anger that had haunted him for weeks. He walked directly to Red Hawk, who stood leaning against a porch post, his face turned toward the rain. Owen stopped before him, his head bowed. The animosity, the suspicion, it had all been washed away. "I heard what you said in court," Owen began, his voice thick with emotion. "About the ambush, about Thorne. I was a fool." He looked up, his eyes meeting Red Hawk's. "Thank you," he said, the words coming from a place of deep, newfound respect. "Thank you for saving my life with your silence." Red Hawk looked at the young man who had caused him so much trouble and saw not an enemy, but a brother. He gave a single, slow nod of acceptance. The debt was paid. Maria appeared in the doorway behind them, her face streaked with tears. But these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, the shedding of a grief she had carried for her own lost family, for a decade of injustice. The land was drinking. The fires were out. From behind the stable, two small Apache children, the sons of one of the scouts, who had been waiting in silence, suddenly burst forth. They ran into the center of the yard, laughing, their faces turned up to the sky, their arms outstretched to catch the impossible. Beautiful rain. It was a baptism, a moment of pure, unadulterated joy in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. Later, inside the small house, as the rain softened to a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof, Eleanor carefully cleaned and bandaged Red Hawk's wound. He sat at the table, his stoicism a thin veil over the deep exhaustion that radiated from him. When she was finished, he sat for a long moment in silence. Then, he reached for the one possession that was the truest part of him, the wooden flute. He held it out to her. She hesitated, her hands hovering in the air. "I can't," she whispered. "That's yours." He pushed it gently toward her again, his eyes insistent. "Keep it," he said, his voice a soft rumble. "When I am silent." Let the flute speak. It was the ultimate act of trust, the final lowering of his defenses. He was giving her his voice, the key to the silent places of his soul. Her fingers closed around the smooth, polished wood, and she felt the warmth of it, the history of it, the countless hours of sorrow and hope that had been breathed through it. As dusk fell, the rain finally stopped. A weak golden light broke through the clouds, bathing the wet, clean world in a fragile glow. They walked outside together, the air cool and fresh. They walked to the well, to the place where their fight had found its anchor. The seal's impression in the mud was a perfect, tiny pool of clear rainwater. He knelt, taking out the cello de tierra. He held it over the wet earth. Then he looked up at her, an unspoken question in his eyes. She knelt beside him. She placed her hand over his, her fingers covering his own. Together, their two hands holding the single seal, they pressed it into the damp earth beside the first mark. A new impression, created by them both. A new beginning, sealed in the wet, dark, living soil. They remained there for a long moment, their hands joined on the seal, the symbol of their shared future. A soft wind blew through the yucca plants, their leaves rustling like a whispered prayer. The silence that fell between them was no longer a fortress or a prison. It was a home. It had finally said everything. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and help us reach more listeners by hitting that hype button. Your support means the world to us.